A towering, scarred Hell's Angel froze at a desolate Nevada gas station as tiny arms wrapped tightly around his leather-clad leg. Onlookers braced for violence, but the terrifying encounter quickly morphed into a heart-wrenching revelation, unearthing a buried past that would shatter the tough biker's world and change 2 lives forever. The Nevada sun was merciless, beating down on Route 95 like a hammer on an anvil. Heat waves shimmered off the cracked asphalt, distorting the horizon into a blurred, watery mirage. For Sarah Hayes, a 28-year-old widow running on fumes, both literal and metaphorical, the suffocating heat was just another weight pressing down on her narrow shoulders. Her rusted 1998 Ford Taurus sputtered and violently jerked before she finally wrestled it into the dirt parking lot of Roy's Oasis, a dilapidated gas station that looked like it had been forgotten by time. The engine gave one final, pitiful hiss as a cloud of white steam erupted from beneath the warped hood. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white, and rested her forehead against the cracked leather. She was exhausted. She was terrified. But mostly, she was entirely out of options. In the back seat, strapped into a faded pink car seat, sat 4-year-old Leora. Leora was the absolute center of Sarah's universe, a brilliant spark of innocence with wide, cornflower blue eyes and a mess of blonde curls that framed her face like a halo. She was clutching her favorite possession in the world, a battered, olive-green stuffed bear named Sergeant Fuzz. "Are we there yet, Mummy?" Leora's sweet, high-pitched voice broke the heavy silence in the car. "Not yet, baby bug." Sarah forced a smile, turning around to wipe a smudge of dirt from her daughter's cheek. "Mummy just needs to give the car a little drink of water, okay?" Sarah stepped out into the blistering heat, the acrid smell of old gasoline and hot dust immediately assaulting her senses. She checked her worn leather wallet. $34.12. That was the sum total of her life savings. It had to be enough to get them across the state line, far away from the nightmare they were fleeing. As she walked toward the rusted pump, a low, guttural vibration began to tremble through the soles of her worn-out sneakers. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a physical sensation, a rhythmic thrumming that seemed to echo from the distant mountains. Within seconds, the vibration grew into a deafening roar. Coming down the highway, cutting through the heat distortion like a mechanized cavalry, was a pack of motorcycles. Sarah's breath hitched. There were at least a dozen of them, riding in a tight, disciplined formation. The chrome of their customized Harley-Davidsons caught the desert sun, blindingly bright. But it wasn't the bikes that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was the riders. Clad in heavy denim and scuffed black leather, they wore the unmistakable 3-piece patches on their backs, the winged Death's Head logo, the top rocker proudly spelling out Hell's Angels. The pack downshifted in unison, a chorus of thunderous backfires echoing off the metal roof of the gas station awning, and rolled into the dirt lot. The dust kicked up in thick, choking clouds as they parked in a perfectly angled row, boxing in Sarah's broken-down Taurus. Sarah froze by the pump, the nozzle slipping from her trembling hands. The sheer, overwhelming masculinity and aggressive aura of the men dismounting their bikes was suffocating. They were massive, heavily tattooed men with unkempt beards, scars, and a hardened look that told of a life lived strictly on their own terms. Leading the pack was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. His road name, stitched onto the front of his cut, was Grizzly, and the moniker fit perfectly. Arthur Pendleton stood 6'4", with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. A jagged, pale scar ran from his left cheekbone down to his jawline, disappearing into a thick, salt and pepper beard. His arms, thick as tree trunks, were covered in intricate ink, skulls, flames, and the bold letters AFFA, Angels Forever, Forever Angels. He exuded an aura of absolute authority and quiet danger. Sarah tried to make herself as small as possible. She kept her head down, desperately praying that the radiator steam would hide her. "Just get the water, pay for the gas, and leave," she chanted in her head. "Don't look at them. Don't speak to them." She unbuckled Leora and lifted her out of the suffocating heat of the car, setting her down by the rear tire. "Stay right here, Leora. Do not move. Mommy is getting some water from the hose," Sarah whispered frantically, her eyes darting toward the bikers who were now congregating near the station's entrance, lighting cigarettes and laughing in deep, booming voices. But the universe, it seemed, had a completely different plan. As Sarah turned her back for a split second to wrestle with the tangled water hose, Sergeant Fuzz slipped from Leora's tiny hands. The stuffed bear hit the dirt and tumbled a few feet away, rolling directly toward the heavy, steel-toed boots of Arthur Grizzly Pendleton, who had stepped away from the pack to light a Marlboro Red. "Sergeant Fuzz!" Leora gasped. Oblivious to the danger, oblivious to the terrifying reputation of the men standing just yards away, the 4-year-old girl took off at a confident waddle. Sarah turned around, the hose dropping from her hands as her heart violently slammed against her ribs. Leora was gone from the tire. Sarah spun around and let out a choked gasp of pure horror. Leora was standing right next to the massive, terrifying biker leader. Grizzly was taking a drag from his cigarette, looking out over the highway, completely unaware of the tiny human standing at his ankles. Leora bent down, picked up her dusty bear, and patted it clean. Then she looked up. Way up. She stared at the giant man in dirty leather, taking in his scars, his tattoos, and his intimidating frown. For a second, the entire gas station seemed to hold its breath. The other bikers stopped talking. The rumble of a lone, idling engine felt deafening in the sudden silence. Instead of running back to her mother, Leora took one step closer. She wrapped her tiny, pale arms as far around Grizzly's thick, denim-clad leg as they could go, resting her cheek against the dusty fabric. It was a full, uninhibited hug. Time stopped. The cigarette slipped from Arthur Grizzly Pendleton's lips, landing in the dirt with a faint sizzle. The towering enforcer stiffened, every muscle in his massive frame instantly going rigid. His heavy hands hovered awkwardly at his sides, as if he had just been handed a live grenade and had no idea how to defuse it. The silence under the gas station awning was absolute, heavy and thick with tension. Silas, a lean, heavily tattooed biker, wearing the sergeant-at-arms patch, took a cautious half-step forward, his hand instinctively dropping toward the heavy hunting knife sheathed at his belt, completely unsure of how to react to this bizarre breach of their perimeter. Sarah was completely paralyzed by terror. Her feet felt like they were cemented to the cracked asphalt. Visions of her daughter being shoved away, or worse, flashed through her panic-stricken mind. "Leora!" Sarah finally shrieked, her voice cracking violently. She sprinted across the blindingly hot tarmac, throwing all caution to the wind. She didn't care who these men were. She only cared about her little girl. She slid to a halt just a foot away from the giant biker, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she reached out to snatch her daughter back. "I am so sorry." "Oh my God, I am so sorry. Please excuse her," Sarah babbled frantically, her chest heaving as tears of sheer terror pricked the corners of her eyes. "She doesn't know better, I swear. We're leaving right now." Grizzly didn't move. He slowly lowered his dark aviator sunglasses down the bridge of his nose, revealing piercing, pale blue eyes. He looked down at the little girl still clinging to his right leg, and then slowly shifted his gaze to the terrified mother. "She's fine. Grizzly rumbled. His voice was incredibly deep, like rocks grinding together at the bottom of a fast-moving river. But to Sarah's absolute shock, there was no anger in it. Leora finally stepped back, looking up at the giant biker with a bright, entirely fearless smile. She held up her stuffed toy. "Sergeant Fuzz got dirty. You have dirty boots, too." Grizzly crouched down, an action that made him look even wider, until he was eye level with the little girl. The leather of his cut creaked loudly in the quiet air. Silas and the rest of the Hells Angels watched in stunned silence. Arthur Pendleton was not known for his patience, let alone his gentle nature with children. "Is that right, little one?" Grizzly asked, his eyes locked on the stuffed animal. It was then that Grizzly noticed the necklace Leora was wearing. It wasn't a standard piece of child's jewelry. Hanging from a simple, braided leather cord around her neck was a set of dull, scratched military dog tags. Grizzly's breath caught in his throat. His massive, calloused hand reached out slowly, his fingers trembling ever so slightly as he gently took the dog tags between his thumb and forefinger. He tilted them to catch the harsh desert sunlight. He read the stamped metal. Hayes, Daniel J. Opos Christian. A violent shudder racked the giant biker's frame. The color drained completely from his deeply tanned face, leaving his scarred skin looking like ash. He dropped the tags as if they had physically burned him and stared wildly at Sarah. "Where?" Grizzly choked out, struggling to pull air into his lungs. He swallowed hard, trying to regain his composure, but his eyes were suddenly glassy and wide. Where did she get these tags? Sarah instinctively pulled Leora behind her legs, shielding her. They belonged to my husband, her father. "Daniel," Grizzly whispered, the name tearing from his throat like a physical wound. "Daniel Hayes." Sarah's eyes widened in profound shock. "How do you know his name?" Grizzly didn't answer immediately. He slowly sank from his crouch, his heavy boots scuffing the dirt, until he was kneeling on the hard asphalt in front of Sarah and Leora. The president of the local Hells Angels charter, a man feared across 3 state lines, was kneeling in the dirt, openly weeping. Thick, heavy tears carved tracks through the dust on his weather-beaten cheeks. "Because," Grizzly managed to say, his voice breaking completely, 12 years ago, outside of Kandahar, your husband carried my bleeding body through a mile of open enemy fire after our convoy hit an IED. I lost my leg that day." Grizzly reached down and firmly tapped his left shin. The heavy metallic clink beneath the denim echoed in the quiet air. "But I didn't lose my life. Daniel gave me my life." Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Daniel had rarely spoken of his tours in Afghanistan. The nightmares had been too heavy, the memories too dark. But she remembered a story about a man named Artie, a stubborn, foul-mouthed soldier Daniel had refused to leave behind in the burning wreckage of a Humvee. "You're Artie," Sarah whispered, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. "I was." The biker nodded, wiping a massive hand across his face. "Before I came home and found a new brotherhood. But Daniel, he was my first brother." Grizzly looked around, his eyes scanning the empty lot and the broken-down Taurus. "Where is he? I've been trying to track him down for 5 years just to shake his hand, to tell him thank you." The desert wind howled mournfully around the gas station awning. Sarah felt her knees buckle slightly, the crushing weight of her reality crashing back down upon her. "Daniel passed away," Sarah cried, her voice barely a whisper. 8 months ago, leukemia. The doctor said it was from the burn pits over there. He fought so hard, Artie. He fought until he couldn't anymore." A collective, heavy silence fell over the Hells Angels. Silas took off his black baseball cap, pressing it against his chest. Behind him, 3 other bikers respectfully bowed their heads. Grizzly closed his eyes tightly, a grimace of pure agony twisting his scarred features. He took a long, shuddering breath, composing himself before he opened his eyes again. When he looked at Sarah this time, the sorrow had morphed into something incredibly intense, something fiercely protective. He stood up, towering over Sarah once more, but this time she didn't feel afraid. "Why are you driving a car with a blown head gasket through the Mojave Desert with a 4-year-old Sarah?" Grizzly asked, his voice returning to that low, authoritative rumble. His piercing eyes swept over her exhausted face, the bruised bags under her eyes, and the meager possessions crammed into the back of her dying car. Daniel's widow shouldn't be stranded at a place like Roy's Oasis. Sarah looked away, ashamed and terrified. She looked down at Leora, who was quietly hugging Grizzly's massive leg again, completely unbothered by the heavy emotional storm raging above her. "We're running," Sarah finally confessed, the dam breaking as a sob tore through her throat. Daniel's older brother, Richard. When Daniel got sick, Richard manipulated the estate. He took the house, he took the life insurance. He has a temper, a violent one. Last week, he came over demanding the last of Daniel's military pension. When I told him no, he put me against a wall. He said if I didn't hand it over, he'd take Leora to teach me a lesson. The atmosphere under the awning changed in an instant. The mournful respect evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, terrifying tension. It felt as though all the oxygen had been sucked out of the desert air. Grizzly turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Silas. No words were exchanged, but Silas gave a slow, dark nod, quietly slipping his hat back onto his head. The other bikers stepped closer, the casual, relaxed posture completely gone. They were no longer resting bikers. They were an army standing at attention. Grizzly reached down and gently placed a massive hand on Leora's blonde head. "No one," Grizzly growled, his voice vibrating with a cold, terrifying wrath that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand up. "Hunt's my brother's family." The blistering heat of the Nevada afternoon seemed to break, giving way to a strange, electrified stillness. Grizzly reached into the deep pocket of his leather cut and pulled out a battered, heavy-duty smartphone. He dialed a single number, his pale blue eyes never leaving the dusty horizon. "Doc!" Grizzly barked into the receiver, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Bring the war wagon to Roy's Oasis on 95. Bring the flatbed, too. We have a pickup." He hung up without waiting for a reply and turned his massive frame back to Sarah. "We are not leaving you out here, and you are not driving another mile in that death trap," Grizzly stated, gesturing a thick, ring-clad finger toward the hissing Ford Taurus. "My brother's wife and his little girl are under the protection of this charter now. Whether you like it or not, Sarah, you have a family again." Sarah stood frozen, the tears drying on her sun-baked cheeks. Her deeply ingrained instinct was to run, to decline the charity of outlaws, but she looked down at Leora. Her daughter was now sitting happily on Silas's customized Harley, giggling as the terrifying sergeant-at-arms gently showed her how to honk the horn. The contrast was staggering, these hardened, violent men melting in the presence of Daniel's child. Within 45 minutes, a matte black Ford Econoline van and a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck thundered into the dirt lot. Behind the wheel of the van was Doc Harrison, a grey-haired, bespectacled biker whose knuckles were covered in faded medical tattoos from his time as a Navy corpsman. The Angels moved with military precision. Iron Mike, a towering enforcer with a completely shaved head, effortlessly lifted the heavy suitcases from the trunk of the dying Taurus, loading them into the back of the van. Silas secured the broken vehicle onto the flatbed. "Climb in," Doc Harrison said warmly, sliding the heavy side door of the van open for Sarah and Leora. "A sea is blowing cold, and there's a cooler full of juice boxes in the back. Grizzly's orders." As the convoy rolled back onto Highway 95, surrounded on all sides by the deafening roar of 12 Harley-Davidsons, forming an impenetrable steel shield, Sarah finally let her head rest against the window. For the first time in 8 agonizing months, the crushing weight in her chest began to loosen. She wasn't alone anymore. 2 hours later, the convoy pulled off a dusty county road and approached a massive corrugated steel compound surrounded by high chain-link fences topped with razor wire. This was the Hells Angels clubhouse. Security cameras tracked their every move, and heavy steel gates groaned open electronically to let them inside. To the outside world, it looked like a fortress, but inside, it was a sanctuary. The interior was vast, smelling of motor oil, old leather, and stale beer. But as Grizzly escorted Sarah and Leora inside, the rough atmosphere immediately shifted. Grizzly called for a church meeting, the sacred mandatory gathering of fully patched members, while Leora was entertained in the recreation room by Doc and Iron Mike, who were busy losing miserably to a 4-year-old at checkers. Sarah sat at the massive oak table in the meeting room. Grizzly sat at the head of the table. "Tell us everything about Richard," he commanded quietly. Sarah took a shaky breath, spilling the dark reality of her brother-in-law. Richard Hayes wasn't just a grieving brother lashing out. He was a desperate man, drowning in debt. He had a gambling addiction that had pushed him into the pockets of a vicious local loan shark syndicate back in Fresno. Richard needed Daniel's military pension and life insurance to save his own legs from being broken. "He's relentless, Artie," Sarah whispered, using Grizzly's real name. "He told me he had ways of finding me. He said he hired a private investigator to track my car." Silas, sitting to Grizzly's right, suddenly slammed his hand flat on the oak table. "The iPad," Silas growled, his eyes narrowing. "When I was moving your bags from the car, I saw an iPad in the side pocket of the kid's backpack. Does it have cellular data? Does it have a tracker app?" Sarah's blood ran cold. "The Find My Family app. Richard set up the family plan years ago. I never thought to turn it off." Doc Harrison, standing by the door, quickly checked a laptop resting on a nearby workbench. He tapped furiously for a few moments, running a quick signal sweep of the compound's immediate area. "Grizzly," Doc said, his voice completely devoid of emotion, a tone that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. "We have an unregistered SUV that just parked 3 miles down the dirt access road. 2 heat signatures. They aren't moving. They're watching the gate." Richard had found them. The nightmare hadn't ended. It had simply followed them into the desert. Grizzly stood up slowly, the leather of his cut creaking loudly in the tense silence of the room. The sorrow that had dominated his features at the gas station was completely gone. In its place was the cold, calculating fury of a wartime commander. "Silas, Iron Mike," Grizzly ordered, his voice an icy rumble. "Get the gates ready. It's time to welcome our guest." The sun began to dip below the jagged Nevada mountains, painting the desert sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood red. The heavy steel gates of the clubhouse compound were left slightly ajar, a deliberate invitation. A black Chevrolet Tahoe kicked up a massive plume of dust as it sped down the access road, coming to a harsh, aggressive halt just outside the compound. The driver's side door swung open, and Richard Hayes stepped out. He was a tall man, but unlike Daniel's athletic build, Richard was thick and soft around the middle, wearing an expensive but wrinkled suit that screamed of misplaced arrogance. From the passenger side emerged Briggs, a hulking, brutally scarred enforcer hired from the Fresno syndicate. Briggs carried a heavy tire iron loosely in his right hand, his eyes scanning the seemingly empty compound with hungry anticipation. "Sarah!" Richard bellowed, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel walls of the clubhouse. "I know you're in there. The tracker led me right to this dump. Bring out the girl, hand over the bank drives, and we can walk away from this without anybody getting hurt." Silence answered him, only the faint whistling of the desert wind. Richard sneered, motioning for Briggs to follow him as he confidently kicked the slightly open steel gate wide, stepping onto the Hells Angels property. "Hiding in a biker bar? Really, Sarah? You think a bunch of greasy mechanics are going to stop me from taking what's mine? You're trespassing on private property." The voice didn't come from a speaker. It came from the shadows of the massive awning covering the garage bays. Suddenly, the floodlights illuminating the compound snapped on with a blinding electrical clack. Richard shielded his eyes, and when his vision finally adjusted, the breath was completely sucked out of his lungs. He hadn't walked into a bar. He had walked into an ambush. Standing in a perfect, impenetrable semicircle were 20 fully patched Hells Angels. They were entirely silent, their arms crossed over their massive chests, their faces stony and entirely devoid of mercy. The sheer, overwhelming aura of organized violence emanating from the men was paralyzing. In the dead center of the semicircle stood Arthur Grizzly Pendleton. He stepped forward, the heavy clink of his prosthetic leg echoing ominously against the concrete. Briggs, the hired muscle, instantly froze. The arrogance melted from his face, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. He recognized the death's head patches. He recognized the man leading them. Briggs slowly, very deliberately, dropped the tire iron into the dirt. It landed with a dull thud. He took 3 steps backward, holding his hands up in universal surrender. "I ain't getting paid enough to mess with the Angels," Briggs stammered, his eyes wide. "I'm out." He turned and sprinted back toward the Tahoe, abandoning his employer without a second thought. Richard was left standing entirely alone, shaking uncontrollably as Grizzly towered over him. "You're Richard," Grizzly stated. It wasn't a question. Who the hell are you?" Richard choked out, taking a panicked step back, only to find Iron Mike and Silas silently stepping behind him, blocking his escape to the gate. "I am the man whose life your brother saved," Grizzly rumbled softly, leaning down so his scarred face was inches from Richard's sweating forehead. "Daniel was a hero. He was a man of honor, and it sickens me to know you share his blood." "She owes me money," Richard shrieked, his voice pitching high with panic. "That pension belongs to the family." Silas stepped forward, pulling a thick manila folder from his leather vest and tossing it violently at Richard's chest. The papers scattered across the dirt. "We made some calls to Fresno," Silas said, his voice dripping with venom. "We know about your $200,000 debt to the syndicate. We also know you forged Daniel's signature on a secondary deed to his house while he was in chemotherapy. That's federal fraud, Richard." Richard stared at the papers in the dirt, bank records, phone transcripts, undeniable proof of his crimes, pulled by the club's extensive underground network in a matter of hours. Grizzly reached out, grabbing Richard by the lapels of his expensive suit, effortlessly lifting the man to his tiptoes. "Here is what is going to happen, Richard," Grizzly whispered, his pale eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. "First, you will sign a full legal release, right here, right now, transferring total ownership of the estate, the pension, and the house back to Sarah. Second, you will never contact Sarah, Leora, or anyone associated with them for the rest of your natural life. Third, you will get in your car and you will start driving. If I ever hear your name whispered in the wind, if I ever see your shadow cross a state line near this charter, You won't have to worry about your Fresno loan sharks breaking your legs. I will personally finish what they started. Do we have an understanding?" Grizzly's voice dropped to a guttural, terrifying whisper. Richard, sobbing openly now, his arrogance completely shattered into dust, nodded frantically. Yes, I swear to God. Just let me go." Doc Harrison brought over a clipboard with the legal documents, which Richard signed with a violently shaking hand, leaving sweat and tear stains on the paper. Once the final signature was scrawled, Grizzly released him. Richard collapsed into the dirt, scrambled to his feet, and ran to his SUV, peeling out of the compound so fast he nearly tore the bumper off on the gate. The heavy steel gates groaned shut, locking with a definitive echoing boom. Grizzly turned around. Standing in the doorway of the clubhouse, holding Leora's small hand, was Sarah. She had watched the entire confrontation. The monster that had terrorized her family, the shadow that had chased her across the desert, was gone, broken and banished. Grizzly walked over to her, his harsh, intimidating demeanor instantly softening. He crouched down once more, looking at the little girl holding the dusty stuffed bear. "The bad man is gone, Leora." Grizzly smiled, a genuine warm expression that made his scars crinkle. "You and your mummy are safe now." Leora let go of her mother's hand, stepped forward, and wrapped her arms around Grizzly's neck, burying her face in his leather vest. "Thank you, Uncle Artie," she whispered. Grizzly closed his eyes, a single tear escaping to trace a path down his cheek. He wrapped his massive arms around the little girl, holding the legacy of the man who had saved him tightly against his chest. "Always, little one," he promised. "Always." Sometimes, guardian angels don't possess ethereal white wings or halos. They wear scuffed black leather, ride roaring iron beasts, and carry the heavy scars of a turbulent past. A single, fearless hug from an innocent child bridged a decade of grief, proving that true brotherhood transcends death. In the heart of the unforgiving desert, a grieving widow and a hardened outlaw found exactly what they had both lost: a family.